Jeff Johnson here. Thanks for tuning in. Today I'm going to chat with you about composition in photography and how the use of composition elements can make your images score much higher in PPA competitions. Composition is what defines a high scoring image. Keep that in mind. That's something that I think goes around as conversation as to what's a good print, what's a good image, well, how do images score well. Composition is what makes your images score better. Keep that in mind. Because composition allows us, the image maker, to transmit thoughts and feelings, make statements about and offer opinions to the judges about the visions that we had in the image. One of my favorite quotes from Henry David Thoreau, "It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see." Just think about that for a minute. It's what you see. So composition creates that story or vision behind the image itself. It helps the viewer see the image instead of just looking at it. Composition exists, though, whether we understand it, whether we like it, or we use it or not. So do we really understand what composition is, though? Do we understand that it can work against us as well as in favor? So check this out, one of my favorite quotes from Ed Weston, friend of Ansel Adams. He says, "Now to consult the rules of composition before making a picture is like consulting the law of gravitation before going for a walk." Just think about that. Composition is a law. It exists. So try this. Get up tomorrow, get all ready for the day, and head out your front door and tell yourself you're not going to bother with gravity and see what happens. That's exactly what this story is all about with composition. So choosing not to use universal guidelines of composition will probably have a negative effect on how your images score. Compositional elements are real, folks. Keep that in mind. So remember this, though. Composition elements are guidelines, not rules. I hate to say that. Rules are such an absolute thing, and that's not what these are. These are suggestions because you can use them differently and at different times and in combinations. So used effectively, though, they can tap into what the human condition inherently understands and expects, however subconscious that may be. Compositional elements, on the other hand, are understood by everyone, consciously or subconsciously, by a PPA juror or by your Aunt Carol, just the same. So these guidelines will help you create more appealing photographs with impact, natural balance, and they'll serve to guide the judges through your image and better understand your story, the ones that you're trying to tell in your imagery. When you become familiar with these composition elements and you make them your everyday tools, you'll find just how powerful they really are. These elements are everywhere, and they are why some photographs work and some don't. So knowing the principles of composition, your unlimited expressive freedom, it gives you this wonderful sense that you can take these elements and create different imagery and not have to worry if it's meeting elemental basics and such. These guidelines will help you make better conscious decisions when creating photographs, I promise. So I used to think I didn't need them. I used to talk with young photographers and they all decided that they just were going to go freehand and go out and shoot and not care. Well, composition can work against you. They can give you the freedom to express yourself in an effective way. The principles of visual design form a recipe for unforgettable, high-scoring photography. That's kind of a mouthful, I know, but it really does matter. So we're talking about art here. Beauty is in the eye of the... Oh, never mind. You know that one. It's kind of cliche, but it does work. It lies in the challenge of creating photographs that will be competition consistent and score high and make you proud of what you're doing every time. So the list of compositional elements is long and arguable. Depends on who you talk to. I've done a search on the internet and found different lists from 6, 10, 20, 35, and they're all titled the most important compositional elements. So the list that follows, you'll see here in a moment, is my best interpretation of what I have learned and what I use. It works for me. So keep in mind that elements of composition are something that, there's lots of them. There's, in my list you'll see there's 50 plus. So what you want to do is learn them a few at a time. Get good at them and keep learning as you go. But you'll realize that you don't necessarily have to know all of them, and you certainly won't use all of them. But the more you understand them, the more they'll fall into place for you. The more you'll be able to see multiple ones in a scene. You won't just see that leading line, but you'll see the rule of thirds, the leading line, the color harmonies, the shape repetitions, and all the different elements that are possibly there. The more elements you can put into a photograph, the more successful it's going to be in competition. That much I can tell you. So the list that follows is my best interpretation of what I've learned and what I use. It works for me. Besides, the best list for you is going to be the one that you use as your favorites. It may not be all of them, it may just be some, but the ones that you use successfully is going to be your best list of compositional elements, and I'll share that with you in just a little bit. You know, I think I'm going to make a t-shirt that says, "Keep calm and compose on." What do you think? So, composition defines a photograph, obviously. It allows the viewer to see, to feel the image. It allows the viewer to attach their memories, their feelings to it. You know, composition, in a sense, is a law. It is real. So good composition can create great photographs. If you forget about composition, or if you totally ignore it, you could get yourself in some trouble with some of your images. So definition of composition is this. It can be thought of as an organization of elements in art according to the principles of art. What? All right. So assembling items in a photograph tells a story, and it conveys a feeling or emotion. You know, it's a suggestion of how to view the photograph. It helps the artist tell a story. It's a subliminal suggestion as to how to feel about an image. You know, we photograph things, then we want to have our viewers view them in the way that we created that piece. So, you know, creating thoughts and stories on an image, the composition conveys that message so the viewer sees it the way we want them to see it. So why does a photograph need composition? Well, it helps an artist tell the story, as I mentioned. It helps you get that point across or convey that feeling. You know, it directs the viewer to see the photograph, as we would say, properly from the artist's standpoint. And it aids the viewer in connecting with the message or the feeling or the emotions that we've connected with it. So what are compositional elements? These are the pieces that we've learned to construct a photograph. But like I said, consider these as guidelines, not rules. You know, I believe that the only rule in photography is that there are no rules. Just keep that one in mind. So what is good composition as a guideline? Again, not a rule. So it offers the viewer opportunities. It suggests possibilities in an image for the viewer to take over with their own imagination, their own stories from their past. And it can be the artist's or the viewer's story. So two influences in composition, though. One conveys your message or tells your story. The other invites the viewer to attach their story to it. And the psychology of composition is very personal. Using the elements that you can relate to, you know, one, two, or more elements in an image, you only need to get comfy with a few of these elements. So here's a list of the elements. Now, before you panic, I'm going to give you a link that you can download this. So don't start jotting it down and get all frustrated because I'm going too fast. So these are several elements of design. There's another page coming up with more as well. Keep in mind that there are also different points of view. If you look up composition on the web, you're going to find many, many lists and different words and even some different definitions of the same words. What's right, what's wrong, I don't know. But here's the thing. You don't necessarily have to know all of these. Yes, obviously, it's better for you. But work with them, get to know them. It'll help your compositions. It'll help your elements be stronger in a scene. It'll help you score better in competitions. And use the ones that speak to you the most. I mean, I understand and can probably describe all of these without this list, but I only use a few by the most part, and you'll be surprised that as you start using some of them, how many more of them pop up their little heads in your images. Here's a few more, as if that list wasn't enough. And hang on a sec here, because here is the link that you can go to, soulroadtrips.com resources. That'll get you to that list of elements. Now, again, it's just a list. There's no definitions, and you're going to have to do your own research to come up with the list there. So let's talk about the elements. Let's talk about some of them. I'm going to talk about these guys and give you some pictures to describe how some of these work. So let's start with the rule of thirds. Now, we've all heard that one, most common, where you simply divide your image into basically a tic-tac-toe board, equal size portions of the scene. And ideally, what you want to do is place a focal point or an interesting part of your image on one of these crosshairs. Now, if you read different articles, and I've seen this both ways, from how that we read left to right, the upper left quadrant and that first crosshair there is going to be the most powerful. In other words, it's going to draw, from what we have learned as North Americans, it's going to draw your eye there first. So I would suggest putting a focal point or something that's very important in your scene on that upper left point. But there's different ways of using this image. Now here I've got kind of more of the important area that I want you to look at first in the second crosshair down. Now, the other way to use these is not just by putting elements on those particular crosshairs. It's to divide a scene as well. So in this case, we have one element that I'd really like you to look at, this seal sitting on the rocks here. You don't have to necessarily put them on that point, but he's in a third. And then I have another element that I want you to look at, is the eagle flying in the background there in the left third. So it's kind of giving us that those boundaries there to look from one focal point to the next, if you will. And here I've kind of placed the bear in that focal point there. So again, it draws your attention to that point first. But also, this is to be used as not just putting the focal point on the actual point of those cross lines, but look at the scene in terms of, and I'm going to go back, I'm going to show you one more here. I've got the foreground, the ocean, filling up 2/3 of the scene, and then 1/3 of the background. I've put the whale's tail on that point to kind of bring you into there. So here's the breakdown of rule of thirds. Putting a focal point on one of the crosshairs is very strong. But using the sections, in other words, the thirds, to break up your scene, in other words, putting maybe your horizon line like I've done here on that top line, that's a good, nice balance of 2/3 of foreground and 1/3 background. Same thing can happen vertically. Let's jump back a picture here to this one here, where we have an interesting portion of the scene on the right third, and then the other a little less interesting or a little less powerful on the third on the left side. So it kind of directs you to both of those elements before you take time looking through the rest of the scene itself. Another element that's very strong is leading lines, and this is helping to guide your viewer through your image from point A to point B, if you will. In this case, I wanted the viewer to come in at the bottom of the bottom right corner of the stream and lead on through up the stream and on out the upper left corner. It creates for motion, it creates for movement, and what's interesting here is that obviously the water is coming down and coming out to the picture, so you could argue that, well, I want you to start at the top left and come out of the bottom right. Again, that's fine. Usually I want you to come from the foreground into the scene, so I'm going to lead you from that bottom corner into that. So in other words, same idea here. You can start in the bottom left corner with the ridge of the sand dune and just follow that up into the scene. That's the path that I'd like the viewer to take in this case. And then they wander off and look at the textures on one side and the textures on the other side of the sand dune. In this image here, we have leading lines that are a little differently. They're not S curves, but we've got different, the shading difference in the water, the direction the boat is pointing, even the slant of the mountains on both sides of the mountains in the background. All of these lead us to where I want you to look, is into that mountain scene in the background there. This one's a little bit more involved. There's a lot of leading lines here, but the idea is to get you to go into that orange chair. So you have lines from spaces between the seats,
the seat backs themselves, the seats themselves, even the numbers on the back of the seats, the lines between, the lines that are built by the angles of the seats, and so on. There's just a lot going on here. And ideally, it leads you all to this one orange seat. And as I talk about multiple elements of design, just look at where that seat is. It falls into, or on, I should say, one of those points from the rule of thirds, that bottom left point. So again, we have 2/3 of the image is the background, and then the bottom third is where this orange chair sits. So you can see how you can start building multiple elements of design together. Here's a nice S-curve, leads us from this snowy bush down in the bottom corner and up through the road, off to the right and behind those trees right there. Here's a very strong one that I think is missed quite often in landscape photography, and this concept of having a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. These are things that are definitely going to draw you into the scene. So here we have very subtle, small amounts of foreground, but it's enough as opposed to just starting the bottom of the photograph at the bottom of the mountains. Here's a chance to kind of wander into the scene. Then we look at the sand dunes, and then up into the mountains and then into the clouds. Same idea here. We start into the meadow and wander into this nice little old barn. Our eye wanders over and sees the tree line, and then back into the mountains, and then up into the interesting patterns into the sky. Same idea here with a little different look, where we have the boat as kind of the foreground, and the reflection of the mountains creates some nice lines that lead us into these mountains, these hills at the horizon line, and then they kind of point off, so it's almost this nice circle movement from the boat up and out and back around to the boat. Here's some more foreground, middle ground, background. It starts with the darker dunes in the foreground, leads us up into the highlight where the sun rays are coming through and brightening up those edges of the dunes, and then bring us up into the cloudy sky in the background. So we have this dimension that allows us to not feel like it's a flat image, but we have motion from direction, I should say, from front to back. This image here, same idea, where we have some nice foliage in the foreground that kind of softly leads us into the first rock formations. Then we travel back to the pink rock formations on the left, and finally into the mountains and the sky. But it lets us move around the scene as opposed to just having if I'd have cropped it up and had just the mountains in the scene, we wouldn't have had that invitation to come in and witness the whole incident here, the whole scene. Again, same thing here. Now this is going into framing. This is another element that I think works very well for landscape photography. And if you notice, what I'm talking about here is just the foreground of the trees in silhouette. It gives us a little bit of, number one, it gives us some foreground to follow into the scene, so this shows some distance between us and the subject in the scene. But it also gives us an opportunity to look at perspective. In our minds, we all have a rough idea of what pine trees look like and the size. And if you look at how small those are in this image, it gives you a better idea of how gigantic this mountain range is in the background. So framing helps us build the perspective and the depth to bring us from camera to scene. Same with this one here, where we've done this a little different look. These few little vines in the foreground lead us up into the old truck, and then back into the vines and the trees behind. Here's also some framing where we have this branch coming from the tree in the foreground. It kind of comes up and over the house and then leads us into the house. And then we have a similar shape of a tree to the right of the house that leads us into the background and allows us to wander around deep into these woods here. And another one here that can be used is reflections. And again, this can fall into repeating patterns, which is another element of design. But we've framed these mountains here with the land, the reflection of the mountains, and then the clouds above with both trees on both sides. Allows us to really have this sense of, I need to go, as a viewer, go look into the mountains and the clouds themselves. Depth of field is a very, I think, a lot of times misunderstood type of an element, and it can be used in many different ways. When you say depth of field, a lot of folks assume that it needs to be sharp from right up against the camera to infinity, and that's not true at all. Depth of field is going to help tell the story. In this case, I wanted this tulip up front to be the prominent feature and allow the rest of the scene to fall off into softness so that your eye explores this tulip, wanders back there quickly, and then comes back to this as being the point of focus. You can also, I was talking about multiple elements of design, you can also look at this and see that this tulip falls on a third. It also is a repetitive pattern. The shape of the tulip and the other tulips in the background all have this same shape, so it's very comforting. And then you have movement from the front tulip on through to the other tulips as well. Here's some more depth of field where we have, again, a shallow depth of field where the columbines are sharp and the background, the field that they were in, has gone soft, allowing these to stand out from that background as well. Again, you can look at things like repetitive patterns where all of the leaves are similar shape, which makes for comfort in viewing an image. More depth of field, the poppy in the foreground here is sharp. The gentlemen in the background are not sharp, but yet you can identify their shapes and the repetitive patterns there, but the depth of field being very shallow allows this poppy in the front to stand out and really be the highlight of this scene. Your eye then wanders back and sees the other poppies and makes you comfortable because now you have multiple shapes that are similar, and even the pattern allows you to view it, but then coming back to the sharp image in the foreground here. This particular image, we have depth of field that covers the whole scene from foreground to background, giving us nice sharpness where it makes us, again, we move from waterfall to waterfall, so we have a nice triangle of view there between the three waterfalls, but all of them being sharp allows us to comfortably move about the scene and feel comfortable that we're in the right spot and yet not being lost by something that isn't sharp purposefully. Here is another full depth of field. We have this just a lot going on. We have the color harmonies there, which is another particular element of design with the warm tones of the sun on the front of the buildings and then the shadows being deeper grays and blues. We have the element here where the lines of the not only the buildings receding into the background, the street, everything pointing that way, it gives us direction. And then even shapes in there of the buildings repeat throughout that make it comfortable for us to view and follow into this scene, take us down the street, and be okay with that and be comfortable with that particular scene. Here's another one that is a very shallow depth of field. This truck is sharp, but the trees and the clouds and everything behind it, the fog is very soft, so it allows us to go back and explore and look at those, but we don't get hung up in it. We come back to the truck because that is the element of focus, the point where its story begins. It also falls roughly on a third if you divide this scene into thirds and gives us an idea that of some different elements of design happening right there. Well, there you have it. Composition for landscape photography. I hope that gives you some idea of how much more in depth you can make your imagery. And of course, I've found from my own experience that taking that time to consider composition to its fullest has brought me higher scoring images in competitions. So hopefully that'll work for you as well. I appreciate you listening in. Till next time, keep seeing the light.